Back to philosophy paper roulette. This is going to be episode 3. I just did one by Chris McDaniel a little while ago. It was kind of interesting on the principle of sufficient reason. I'm going to try to do another analysis paper because they are more manageable to do. Although I will get back to longer papers at some point. If you have any suggestions, please send them along. Send me a message, put it down in the comments, and I will take a look. I have not read any of these papers before. These are just my honest reactions to them as we are going. So these are just more analysis papers. This will be like, show you where we are. Analysis year 2019. And let's scroll through. Necessary to perfect being. Aristotle's argument from Truth and Metaphysics 4. Let's see. Principle of non-contradiction 4. Graham Clay, not Graham Priest on non-contradiction. Interesting. Let's see. Against the demonstrability of principle not, well, the one located in gamma 3 and the other found in 4. I argue that Aristotle also relies on a third argument for the same conclusion, the argument for truth. Okay, this is, yeah, you can't argue for the principle of non-contradiction. It's called the adoption problem in sort of some more contemporary lingo. Let's just take a look at this quick. Relies on a few of Aristotle's core views of truth. It is faithful to his considered proposition throughout his corpus, and it may be the strongest argument he could offer for the indemonstrability of principle of non-contradiction. Shoot. It's here, so let's take a look. Okay, forthcoming in analysis, Graham Clay. So, Aristotle's primary formulation of the principle of non-contradiction in its most universal form, PNC, is found in Metaphysics 3, as translated by Christopher Kerwin. It is as follows. For the same thing to hold good and not to hold good simultaneously of the same thing and in the same respect is impossible, given any further specifications which might be added against the dialectical difficulties. Yeah. Much of the literature is... Oh, wait, I want my music. Why is my music not playing? Hold on 1 second. Not hearing anything. There we go. Set the mood. Much of the literature dedicated to Aristotle's view of the principle of non-contradiction in gamma is understandably focused on his attempts there to refute those who deny that the principle is true. In this context, a refutation is a method of argumentation that, when successful, shows that one's opponents must assume or rely upon what they claim to deny, either in denying it or in virtue of their other commitments, blah, blah, blah. There is, however, a further question about Aristotle's motivation for devoting much of his attention to refutations. The answer is that he thinks that the principle of non-contradiction is indemonstrable. It is normally taken for granted that he is right about that. He may be, but the arguments he marshals for this conclusion prove to be interesting and instruction. Yes, it is very hard to argue for or against principles of logic. This is the adoption problem. Goes back, at least the contemporary discussion goes back to Lewis Carroll, what the tortoise said to Achilles. And, yeah. According to Aristotle, demonstrations are sound deductive arguments with necessary truths for premises. Moreover, the premises of demonstrations must be better known than prior to and asymmetric explanations of their conclusions. Although the premises of a demonstration necessitate its conclusion, it cannot be the case that if all the members of any proper subset of its premises are true, then its conclusions must be true. This last conclusion rules out irrelevant premises that do not belong to the set of premises that necessitate a given conclusion. It also rules out question-begging premises which are either identical to the conclusion or entail it, since those premises are true only if the conclusion is true. There are many other features of demonstrations, but these are sufficient for our purposes. Let's see. Yeah. Anything more to comment on this stuff? Not yet. It is commonly thought that Aristotle gives two arguments in favor of thinking that the principle of non-contradiction is indemonstrable. One recent prominent interpretation of the first is that it turns on the claim that the PNC is the firmest principle that all those who demonstrate go back to, and that is the principle of all the other axioms also. In his development of this interpretation, M.V. Whedon calls the claim that all those who demonstrate to go back to the PNC the ultimacy claim, since there is a clear sense in which indirect proofs, in moving from contradictions in their premises to their conclusions, go back to the principle of non-contradiction. The mystery for Whedon is how... This is a long sentence. The mystery for Whedon is how the ultimacy claim is true of direct proofs. Yeah, and there's always a question exactly what's going on in an indirect proof. That's, questions for logicians to really understand. In short, Whedon argues that to display the validity of direct proofs, one must make an appeal to consistency, which is just an appeal to the truth of the PNC. A direct proof is valid if and only if it is logically impossible for the conjunction of the premises and the negation of the conclusion to be true. Since all demonstrations are direct or indirect proofs, it follows that all those who demonstrate go back to the PNC, and thus a demonstration of the PNC would go back to it as well. Okay. I mean, yeah. Let's continue, because that makes sense, but I think whether or not Whedon is right about what it means to go back to the PNC, it is clear that Aristotle's first argument expresses his worry that any purported demonstration of the PNC would be problematically reliant on its own conclusion. At the very least, if any axioms could be used to demonstrate the PNC would have the PNC as a principle of them, then there is nothing from which the PNC could be demonstrated. The premises of such a demonstration would not be better known than prior to or asymmetric explanations of the PNC, because it bears these relations to them in virtue of being the principle of all other axioms. It is commonly thought that this is just what it is to be a principle of something else. The first argument against the demonstrability of the PNC is found in Gamma 3 and has long been the subject of dispute due to ambiguities in Aristotle's presentation. Aristotle's second argument for the same conclusion turns on the claim not that everything could be demonstrated, because if everything could be demonstrated, there would be an infinite regress of demonstrations. Aristotle indicates that if there were an infinite regress of demonstrations, it would undermine the status of demonstrations as demonstrations. To stop this vicious regress, Aristotle argues that we need indemonstrables, and that he proposes the PNC is the best candidate for being an indemonstrable. So, argument has to stop somewhere, and the principle of non-contradiction is where the buck stops. This argument is found in the first paragraph of Gamma 4, and it too is well known. Aristotle considers a similar regress throughout the posterior analytics. In addition to these, Aristotle, in fact, has a third argument for the indemonstrability of the PNC, or so I will argue. This is the second time I've seen this turn of phrase in the last few days. Very interesting. Or so I will argue. I call this third argument the argument from truth. It crucially relies on the claim that at least one premise of any possible demonstration of PNC would entail PNC. Okay? But if this is so, then a purported demonstration of the PNC would violate the requirement that no demonstration have question-begging premises. Yeah, if it follows from itself, then it's just question-begging. Well, let that go. But yeah, it'd be circular in some way. And then we'd be, what are you actually demonstrating with your circularity? aptly, the argument from truth relies on two core features of Aristotle's views on truth: his definitions of truth and falsehood, and the principle of bivalence. Aristotle does not explicitly formulate this third argument, but I maintain that it is the best argument that he could give to defend some of his statements in the second paragraph of Gamma 4. Furthermore, I believe that this argument provides confirming justification for Aristotle's pivot to refutations of the denier of the principle of non-contradiction. Let's see what Graham Priest has to say about that. Alright. Okay, so this is a reconstruction of something Aristotle could have said but was not super explicit about, even if Aristotle did mean to say what this author wants. Always a little difficult to put words in someone else's mouth, especially when they've been dead so long, but under the principle of charity, you should always find the strongest argument, especially for deceased authors, and see if they really had something going for them, because, writing's hard. Sometimes you just miss stuff when you write it down. So this is a good strategy for a paper. The statement that I take to indicate the argument from truth are only mentioned in passing by Kerwin in his commentary, and like other interpreters, he does not read them as indicating the presence of a third argument. On the contrary, Kerwin reads them as simply part of Aristotle's introduction to his refutations, and in particular to the refutation from signification, wherein Aristotle tells us that the denier of PNC is implicated in affirming the PNC and signifying anything at all. I do not deny this. I agree that effecting a transition to refutations is Aristotle's ultimate goal here. Okay. Yet from the way that the second paragraph of Gamma 4 is structured, it becomes clear that Aristotle has a third argument in mind that necessitates the transition. After all, neither of the other two arguments seem to be decisive, since the first suffers from ambiguities and the second is quick and amounts to no more than the proposal that the PNC is the best indemonstrable to stop a vicious regress of demonstrations. Here's a relevant part of the paragraph as translated by Kerwin. By demonstrating the manner of a refutation, I mean something different from demonstrating, because in demonstrating one might be thought to beg the original question. Okay. But if someone else is cause of such a thing, it must be refutation. If someone else is cause of such a thing, it must be refutation and not demonstration. In response to every case of that kind, the original step is not to ask him to state something either to be or not to be, for that might well be to believe to beg what was originally at issue, but to at least signify something both to himself and to someone else, for that is necessary if he is to say something. Okay. The two important segments of this quotation are Aristotle's statements that in demonstrating one might be thought to beg the original question, yes, and that in response to every case of that kind, the original step is not to ask him to state something either to be or not to be, for that might well be believed to beg the question. Okay, what was originally at issue? The first statement is puzzling. Aristotle may seem to claim that a demonstration of the PNC should not be sought because demonstrations in general beg the question. But this cannot be what he has in mind, because, as mentioned before, in demonstrations the conclusions must be true in virtue of all the premises, while in question-begging arguments the conclusions only depend on a proper subset of them. Rather, he must be claiming that there is something special about purported demonstrations of the PNC that make them question-begging, no matter how they are formulated. And I do not think that Aristotle is here referring to alternative kind of question-begging he discusses in Prior Analytics 2:16. That kind of occurs whenever a man tries to prove by means of itself what is not known by means of itself. But if anything is known by means of itself, the PNC is. Therefore, Aristotle's concern is entirely different. Let me explain. Okay, so it's a different sort of begging the question that Aristotle is worried about. Let's see. The claim here is that in demonstrating, one might be thought to beg the original question, And the second thing is, in response to every case of that kind, the original step is not to ask him to state something or to not be, or not to be. Okay. I mean, what's going on here is signify something. Of course, the signify here is a little bit, I don't know what that signifies. Okay, we'll see. Where was I? Oh yeah, let the guy explain. Is it a guy? Who is this again? Graham. Yeah, probably a guy. Okay. Although Aristotle does not explicitly say what is about the demonstrated that makes them question begging, the second argument of the quotation is a vital clue. In the second segment, Aristotle is concerned with refutations of the denier of PFC rather than demonstrations. Okay. But he again mentions begging the question, thus linking the segment to one before it. This is not an odd connection. Well, they're like the next sentence, so it shouldn't be that odd. After all, Aristotle says elsewhere that both the demonstrator and the dialectician argue deductively after assuming that something does or does not belong to something. Yes. Language that is strikingly similar to that found in the second segment. He is clear that all deductions can be question begging in the way I have discussed. See above, I guess. If we interpret the first segment in light of the second because of this commonality, the natural reading of the first segment is that it is an expression of Aristotle's belief that the premises of demonstrations are the problem. It is because the premises of demonstrations are truths that must state something either to be or not to be that purported demonstration of PNC beg the question. As we will see, since premises of demonstrations are truths, each of them must state something either to be or not to be, with the or in this clause interpreted as exclusive. That is, they cannot state something both to be and not to be. That's a reasonable interpretation of Aristotle. Yes, it cannot be the case that for any premises of a demonstration of PNC, if the premise is true, then PNC must be true. That would be to beg the question. Okay, so if any purported demonstration of PNC would have a premise that ranges over all things, then any such demonstration would be question begging and not a demonstration at all. Since the PNC ranges over all things in its most universal form, the form which Aristotle is concerned with here, the antecedent of this conditional is true. Yeah. So basically, if you're talking about something that ranges over all things, it's a universal of some sort, then it is universal. And it's begging. You would be not a demonstration, since you've already assumed that in the premises. The second segment concerns refutations, but Aristotle's concern there is parallel. Aristotle is saying that he cannot demand his interlocutor, the denier of PNC, to do anything but signify something, a demand contrasted with the outlaw demand from the quotation to state something either to be or not to be. If his interlocutor were to state the truth, then, as we will see, Aristotle could deduce the principle of non-contradiction must be true of what the truth ranges over. And if she were to state a falsehood, then a truth condition that entails the falsehood of the PNC could not be deduced, because Aristotle holds that no truth entails the falsehood of PNC. Thus, there would be nothing Aristotle's interlocutor could say that has the falsity of the PNC as a consequence. As a plausible reading this may seem, one should wonder why should we think that truth cannot state something both to be and not to be. Yes, this is the dialethous position. That is, we must read the or from the second segment as thus must we read the or from the second segment as exclusive. Well, Aristotle, I'm sure, would have been that way. It could be that something x is phi and not phi. If this is possible, then one could truthfully state that x is phi, that x is not phi, or that x is both phi and not phi. The principle of non-contradiction is false when instantiated to x and phi. That is, phi both holds good and does not hold good of x, and true statement when of what x is entailed, the negation of PNC, or so it seems. Yeah, so you'd be saying some things that would be both true and false depending on maybe circumstance. The apparent possibility of truthfully stating some being that violates the PNC seems to be evidence against there being a third argument for the indemonstrability of the PNC. If one could make such a truthful statement, then it would undermine my claim that Aristotle thinks that the PNC must be true of what truths range over. The principle of charity demands that we not attribute a view to Aristotle that is open to such a counterexample, even if his statements seem to suggest that he holds it. Let's see. He's saying, well, we shouldn't. The apparent possibility of truth was saying something that the violence opinion seems to be evidence against there being a third argument for the indemonstrability of it. Well, yeah, sure. If you claim things that Aristotle wouldn't claim, then the argument that Aristotle presents based on things that don't apply doesn't hold. Alright, but we're not talking about that. Aristotle wouldn't have been a dialethist. At least I don't think there's many interpretations like that. However, I think these appearances are deceiving. Oh, deceiving. There's a relatively simple and plausible argument that can be attributed to Aristotle that both avoids this problem and makes sense of his statements at some spot. Getting clear about how this argument most plausibly would work by formulating precisely and providing justifications for its premises shows that there is no problem after all. Following Aristotle, I treat the principle of non-contradiction as universal that says for all x where x is a thing and for all phi where phi is a non-linguistic predicate, it is impossible, non-linguistic, don't get liar paradoxed. It is impossible for phi to hold good and not to hold good of x simultaneously in the same respect and so on. What it means is that for principle non-contradiction to be true of a thing x is for there to be no phi such that phi holds good and does not hold good of x. Throughout, I treat statements of the form phi holds good of x to be equivalent to statements of the form x is phi. Aristotle uses the former kind of language in his formulation of the principle of non-contradiction and the latter in his formulation of his definitions of truth and falsehood. So the argument runs as follows. Show a demonstration of the PNC is impossible. Premise 1. A demonstration is a sound deductive argument where the premises are necessary truths and where it is not the case that if all the members of any proper subset of the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Premise 2. It cannot be the case that for any premise of a demonstration of the principle of non-contradiction, if the premise is true, then the principle of non-contradiction must be true. It cannot be the case that for any premise demonstration of the premise in the PS must be true, yes. The principle of non-contradiction must be true of the things that truths range over. Premise 4. If any premise of a demonstration of the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of non-contradiction must be true of the things that the premises range over. The principle of non-contradiction ranges over all things, and at least one premise of the demonstration of the principle of non-contradiction must range over all things. A demonstration of the PNC is impossible. Okay, so let's... Any premise of the demonstration PNC. Yeah, so right here is where this is the only cannot in this area, but then you show here that one of these things does this thing at P2. Okay. P1 is part of Aristotle's definition of demonstration. P2 is its application in the present case. P3 is the crucial premise. Well, it's a crucial understanding of principle of non-contradiction, and it is what is challenged by the apparent possibility of truthfully stating of some being that violates the PNC. Premise 4 follows from P1 and P3, yes. C follows from P2 and P4, and P2, P4, and P5. P5 will be discussed below, but first an argument for P3 is needed. Yeah, sure. I mean, we'll see. As background, consider, because you're gonna need background for P3. That is fair enough. The truth of things that truths range over. what's the scope of the principle of non-contradiction then? If it is not, if the scope is not as wide as it might be, then maybe there are truths outside the principle of non-contradiction, and again, you'd be a dialethist of some sort at that point, and Aristotle you wouldn't attribute that to Aristotle. As background, consider Aristotle's definition of the truth and falsehood, and perhaps its clear statement on bivalence, which is found at Gamma 7, as translated by Kerwin. This will be plain if we first define what truth and falsehood are. For to say that that which is not or that which is not is a falsehood, and to say that which is and that which is not is true. So that also he who says that a thing is or not will have the truth or be in error. Yeah. In this passage, Aristotle argues that if you deny phi something that is phi, or affirm phi something that is not phi, then you will be stating a falsehood. And if you affirm phi something that is phi, or deny something that is not phi, then you will be stating a truth. Aristotle's transition from these definitions to a statement of bivalence is commonly seen as inferential, and it is clear why, since it follows from these definitions that whether you affirm phi of something or deny phi of something, you will be stating a truth or a falsehood. That is, there are no affirmations or denials that are neither true nor false. No gaps and no gluts, I guess. There are two forms of the PB. Peanut butter? Where's PB? I don't miss something? Alright, whatever. It must be just this sort of thing. Principle of bivalence, I'm sure. What I will call the dialethic PB, PBD, is a claim that there are only two truth values, true and false. It is dialethic because it makes room for that there are possibility something is both true and false. The stronger form of PB is what I will call the monolithic PBM, which states there are only truth values, true and false, and has nothing, and nothing has them both. Okay, no overlapping truth values. In the above passage, Aristotle states the PBD, and the argument he presents for the passage does not require the PBM. The same goes for the other context in which he most explicitly mentions the PB. However, at no point does Aristotle consider the possibility that there is something that is both true and false simultaneously in the same respect and so on, much less does he argue against the PBM. Why does this matter? Well, if the PNC could be false of something x that a truth ranges over, then there could be an x such as psi, such that x is psi and x is not psi. Again, given Aristotle's definition of truth and falsehood, it follows that there could be a truth, t, that states x is psi, but also follows that there could be a falsehood, f, that states the same thing, namely that x is psi. So t is f! Exclamation point. Thus, there could be a statement that is both true and false, namely x is psi, but if Aristotle holds PBM, then there could not be any statements that are true and false. And so it follows that PNC could not be false of something x that a truth ranges over. That is, P3, the PNC must be true of the things that truth ranges over. Okay, fair enough. So what we've done here is given a little transparency to the concept truth here. So PNC, it has to transparently translate to all the things truth range over. I'm gonna lose my voice if I keep podcasting. Transparent truth. So if you've got non-contradiction, that means it applies to the things themselves, not just what was that, 3? True of the things that truth ranges over. So it's that PNC gets applied to all the things truth does. Given that demonstrations have necessary truths for premises, you assume demonstrations have truths for premises. Aristotle must rely on his definition of truth and falsehood in his definition of demonstration. Yet, as mentioned, the innocence of the assumption of PBM is not quite as clear-cut, especially in this context, since PNC is true if and only if the PBM is true. And so anyone who denies PNC would also deny PBM. Although it may be sufficient for my interpretive purpose to simply note that the PBM is taken for granted by Aristotle throughout his corpus, yes, and that it is required to make sense of his statements at that spot, it would be ideal if further reason could be provided for interpreting Aristotle as being committed to the PBM. Okay, fair enough. Perhaps the best reason that can be offered on Aristotle's behalf has to do with his view of falsehoods as erroneous assertions that fail to correspond to the world as it is. Saying X is phi about some X which is phi and not phi is to utter a truth according to Aristotle's definition, but there is a sense in which it differs from saying Y is phi about the something Y which is phi but not phi. The truth is something of a half-truth, since it is also false. Well, I don't know. That's an interpretation there, while the latter is not. Because you could say it's a full truth, and then later you say it's a full not. Now the question is, what's the assertion amounted to? But you can, you have to be clear about half-truth, assertion. You're gonna multiply concepts here. Alright, the form of truth is something of half-truth, since it's also false, with the latter is not, but there is no alternative, at least on Aristotle's definitions. No, there isn't. To say the whole truth about X, namely X is phi and not phi, is to say the whole falsehood, since it is to say X is neither phi nor not phi. If Aristotle endorsed PBD, there would be pressure on him to alter his definition of falsehood such that nothing false can be said of X with respect to phi. Since all of the purported falsehoods that we could say about X with respect to phi are truths, they are not erroneous in any sense. No assertion predicating some phi of something can fail to correspond with the world while simultaneously succeeding in doing so. Thus, cases where the PNC is violated erode the distinction that Aristotle makes between truth and falsehood. In this way, Aristotle's theory of what truth and falsehood are presupposes the PBM, and his definitions would need revision were he to accept the principle of non-contradiction as false in any instance. Since a wholesale adjustment is not forthcoming, we have further reason to interpret Aristotle as not being open to the PBD. Okay. Yeah, but not entirely buying this argument, but it's very reasonable given what Aristotle said. You have a few of these different concepts working. I'm not sure what a half-truth is here because Aristotle doesn't have half-truths. Aristotle just says he would have to alter his definition of half-truths in it, but the question is that a modern innovation that we're forcing on Aristotle, and interpreting what Aristotle might have said in that case could be a little dicey. But it's fair to assume Aristotle wouldn't have put up with that. I mean, his arguments for the principle of non-contradiction were basically arguments against the monists, say like Parmenides of the day, who would have said everything is one, and so you'd have truth and false as one. And so Aristotle was saying, no, that's not how it works. And so since it was like there's a sort of anti-Parmenidean flavor to some of what he was saying, it's a very reasonable interpretation what is going on, like saying the principle of bivalence holds for Aristotle. Now, with the argument for P3 in hand, it should be clear why the principle of non-contradiction must be true of the things that truths range over. If this were not the case, then violations of the PBM would be possible, but there is reason to think Aristotle maintains or should maintain that they are not. Thus, the apparent possibility of truthfully asserting of some being that it violates the PNC, and so phi and not phi, is only an appearance, and there is no room to read something either to be or not to be from the second argument met with an inclusive or. Yeah. What about premise 5? It states that at least one premise of any demonstration of the PNC must range over all things, which is what the PNC ranges over. Yeah, again, scope of ranging over things here. In the prior analytics 1, 4 to 6, after analyzing the different forms that syllogistic deductions take, Aristotle draws several conclusions about general features of deductions, one of which is the claim that a deduction with a universal conclusion requires at least two universal premises. Okay. Since as noted, demonstrations are a species of deduction, this conclusion applies to them. The most universal form of the PNC is that the form of the argument from the truth concludes is indemonstrable. In its most universal form, the PNC says that for all x, where x is a thing, and for all phi, where phi is a non-linguistic predicate, it is impossible for phi to hold good and not to hold good of x, simultaneous in the same respect, and so on. So it ranges over all things. Yes, well, this is an understanding of how you're quantifying for all x. Let's give the for all x. It's a question there exactly what the quantifier is, and the domain attached to that quantifier. So it ranges. I'm looking. Is there something else said about what the all is here? I don't know. It follows that the PNC is a universal, and the premises of a demonstration of it would be themselves have to be universals. Yes, because Aristotle also argues in the prior analytics 1, that the subject of the universal conclusion of an argument with universal premises must be the subject of at least one of its universal premises, and the subject of the PNC is things. That means one of the premises of a demonstration of the PNC would have to be a thing as its subject, yes. So given that it has already been shown that the premises must be a universal, it must range over all things. So P5, and thus with P2 and P4 in hand, the conclusion C that demonstration of the PNC is impossible. Okay. So, thanks to all these very nice people right here at the bottom. So the argument here is that, that in Aristotle's claiming that arguing from, or any sort of demonstration from universals to particular conclusions, then that demonstration has to be, in some sense, an object or a thing following from those universals. However, if you're going to get yourself a universal again at the end, then it would have to be a subject of that, some sort of smaller thing. But it can't be a smaller thing because it basically is a universal itself. So it can't be, you can't argue from a universal down to something that is just as big as itself. So let's see. We've got an argument going. So this third argument then is different from the other ones. Why? What were the other arguments? Okay, so we got the first argument here is, you have to rely on it. The second argument turns out, let's see, infinite regress. You have to start somewhere. And then the third one says, look, the way we argue is from universal truths to some sort of particular that we didn't know before. But the problem is, or something that is more particular. And to show that something universal, we'd have to start with some giant things that were even bigger than a universal truth, but you can't do that. We have nothing already. If we're going to argue for something that would get to the principle of non-contradiction, it would have to be more universal than that, but you can't get any more universal than universal. So there is no argument for it. Yeah, so I guess this is really what the word signify means. Because you have to get from some sort of bigger thing to signify, specify, pick out something more particular when you are arguing this way. Okay, so that's a fair argument, actually. It's in the method of argumentation, that the method of argumentation that Aristotle was working with cannot be used to prove the sort of thing that the principle of non-contradiction is. Okay. So that's a cute argument. I think it's actually kind of interesting. It's a argument from argument structure. Good job, Aristotle. Good job, Graham something or other. Graham Clay. So, that's not bad. Argument from argument structure. Okay. Alright, if you like this, leave me a note. Tell me what you want to review in the future. Yeah. Thanks. Have a good day.